Hello and welcome to the Evaluator, a podcast by the Independent Evaluation Unit, IEU, of the Green Climate Fund, GCF, the world's largest multilateral climate fund. I am your host, Yeonji Kim, Communications and Editing Associate at the IEU. The IEU aims to conduct evaluations that will help make the GCF faster, smarter, and better. We are committed to collecting and producing high-quality evidence to inform policymaking within the GCF and the broader international climate finance arena that translates into better outcomes on the climate action front. The Evaluator brings you compelling insights on cutting-edge topics related to evaluation, climate action, and development, featuring experts from across the globe as well as from within the IEU. This episode of the Evaluator looks at something that could help bridge the gap between the clear scientific evidence of climate change and the lack of effective climate action in practice. We explore how behavioral insights can be integrated in climate projects and climate change advocacy for better impact and positive change. Joining me in the studio are three members of the IEU who have taken keen interest in the topic of behavioral science in the context of climate action. They have written blogs exploring this very concept. First, we have Mr. Cornelius Kruger, Research Assistant Consultant and also a member of the IEU's Behavior and Design Lab, which in short is called the BaDLab. His paper, Going the Last Mile, Behavioral Science and Investments in Climate Change Mitigation and Adaptation, won the Best Paper Award at the Climate 2020 online conference. This paper was co-authored by the head of the Independent Evaluation Unit, Dr. Jasna Puri, who goes by the name Joe. Congratulations to Cornelius and Joe on this achievement. Next, we have Ms. Iben Hjorth, IEU's Communications and Uptake intern, who recently published a blog titled, Let's Talk About Evidence, Behavioral Insights to Help Us Communicate. Her blog was featured in the Korea Times. Then we have Dr. Archi Rastogi, who is an evaluation specialist at the IEU. In his blog, Will the Climate Strikes Create Impact? He argued that using behavioral insights could boost the impact of climate strikes. You can follow Archie on Twitter at Archi Rastogi. Well, a big hearty welcome to the three guests. Welcome to the Evaluator.
Thank you, Yeonji. Pleasure to be here.
Good afternoon and thank you.
Thanks, Yeonji.
All right, so you all have written a blog that contains some elements of behavior change, climate change advocacy, and development, right? So let's delve into your blogs a little bit. So Iben, your blog was published by the Korea Times in May, so congratulations. So can you tell us briefly about the key message of your blog?
Yeah, so the blog was written from the point of view of communications. So IU does a lot of work on behavioral insights, and my idea was if we're using behavioral insights in our work, in our operations, why not use it in our communications as well? We should be smart about how we speak to people and how we communicate evidence. Research has been done that gives us insights into how we can communicate evidence better, and who else would make use of that kind of insights if not the Independent Evaluation Unit of the GCF?
All right, thank you very much for that. So behavioral insights. When I joined the IEU, I also realized that the IEU invests a lot of time and energy on, looking into this concept. But Cornelius, so you are also a member of the BaDLab. So can you tell us briefly, on this idea of behavioral insights? We use that insight in communicating impact and evidence as well. Can you tell us briefly, why we should care about this topic?
Yes, Yeonji, the problem with climate change and is very closely linked to behavioral change and behavioral science. Because we have known for years that climate change is real and that we must act. So we have the knowledge. We may have the intention most likely, but we do not act. So, and those are actually the key topics which behavioral science is all about. What happens? How do we perceive information? How do we form intentions? How do we make decisions? And how do we act upon that? In each of these linkages, there may be some errors, some heuristics in which we think and in which we fail to reach our goals.
Thank you. That's very useful. So, coming back to this idea of using behavioral insights in, climate projects or advocating for climate change agenda. Archi, you recently wrote a blog about these popular climate strikes around the world. So you say their message is really powerful and good, and yet they lack specificity. So can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, Yeonji. So my blog came from the perspective of political theory, where I was arguing that the movement, because it did not have a specific agenda, would be discredited because no specific outcome would be associated with that movement. But it ties very closely to the message that Iben had in her blog, where she said that messages need to be simple. And one of the things that the climate strikes got right was that their message was very simple, straightforward, and easy to understand. And that's why their mobilization was so successful.
All right, so you mentioned this message, this powerful message by Greta Thunberg. So she says, the empty promises are the same, the lies are the same, and the inaction is the same. Very powerful, right? Wouldn't you say? But if you were to add these behavioral insights, how would you change this message? Would it somehow downgrade the powerfulness of this message if you start adding some specific or measurable things to that? Cornelius, do you have a quick input?
As Archi said, it is important to have a clear goal. So I may have a lot of emotions about a topic, but if I don't have a clear steps to follow, if I don't have options, then after a while I may not think about it further because another problem has caught my attention, has elicited my emotions. So for example, now Corona is all over the news, now people are anxious about Corona. And climate change gets out of the spotlight. So without having clear options, clear activities to follow through, it's difficult to put emotions into action.
So Iben, as a communicator, how would you put that into practice?
I just like to give a more recent example of how this might work. So right now, Black Americans are not just saying Black Lives Matter. They're also saying, stop killing us. They're saying, defund the police. That's as concrete as it gets almost for that kind of huge movement, right? I think that will definitely improve the chances of the protest having an effect.
Thank you. So going back to Iben's blog, she had this very interesting example. So one of the things you should do, if a specific action by people is required, do break it down into small, easily followed steps. So I completely agree with you. But with small, easily followed steps, are we going to get the speed that's required for climate action?
Can I take that on, Yeonji? So there is research from the social psychology literature that talks about 6 Americas. So there are 6 predominant ways in which people think about climate change. And this relates to some of the message that Cornelius wrote about in his blog about worldviews. So these are ways in which we think about the world and they become our worldviews. And I've done some research also on that in the context of tiger conservation, where we found among conservationists, there were 5 predominant ways of thinking about tiger conservation in that case. Now, no individual subscribes completely only to one worldview, but you can subscribe to multiple worldviews. Some of the worldviews are mutually incoherent, but there are areas of consensus. My research also proved that if you mobilize these areas of consensus, then you can get a lot of mobility. And I think some movements which are very popular movements, such as the Black Lives Matter movement or the climate strikes, got some of that messaging right, where they were able to reach out to people with diverse worldviews at the same time because their messaging was so simple and clear and coherent. If your actions are too elaborate, you risk delineating or alienating others who might otherwise join your movement or might sympathize with your movement but might not if the message is too specific or too elaborate.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for that. Actually, Iben commented on that aspect as well. If you, keep feeding people with such negative information, ooh, we are doomed if no action is taken, then, people get, oh, this is too much negativity, we are not getting anywhere, my action wouldn't make any difference, right? So that was one of the key messages. So Cornelius, do you have something to say to that?
Yes, so the problem is, if I describe the problem as too big, then of course people cannot see their importance in achieving a change. But I want to give an example where in each individual action makes a difference, and that is food waste. So there is research that food waste globally alone produces as much greenhouse gas emissions that it would be counted as the third largest emitter compared to countries. So food waste alone would emit as much greenhouse gases as many countries. So that's something where you can look in your own household, how much food do I buy, how much do I consume, how much gets thrown away. And sometimes we don't realize how much we actually waste because we don't want to think about it. It makes us feel bad about ourselves. So if we put ourselves the right reminders in the right spots where those reminders should be in the situations where we are most likely to take action. I want to give a simple example. When we look at the best before date, it is written in numeric form like June the 21st, but few people will actually say, oh, today is June the 21st, but rather people say, oh, today is Wednesday. So what people are now trying is to put the day of the week in addition to the weekday to help people realize how long the food is actually still good to consume, and thus to better plan and to reduce food waste.
Thank you very much for that. So from Cornelius' early input, you talked about reminders. I think this idea of reminders is really great, at least, for the people who are willing to take them and take action on them. But also in your paper, your best paper at the 2020 climate conference, right? You talked about these nudging approaches and also boosts. Can you tell us briefly about what these approaches are?
So nudges are about restructuring the environment in which we make decisions. So the idea is to make the desired action the easiest. For example, I go to a cafeteria and I pick the first food first, which is on the buffet. Whereas if I go to the end of the buffet, my plate is already full and I have less space to take that. I do have the choice among all the different types of food, but I still choose mostly what comes first. On the other hand, boosts enable people to make the right choices by giving them the right soft skills or giving them useful rules of thumb. However, nudges may be short-lived, but they have a clear outcome. Whereas boosts, when we just give people the skills, we assume that they already have the right motivation to do so.
Right. So if we don't have much time, the clock is ticking for climate action, then maybe it's best that the policymakers, the decision makers, make the choices easy for people. So they frame these choices as easy, most reasonable choices that they could readily take. I mean, that's my take on Cornelius's input right now. Okay, Archie, go ahead.
And that's actually something we use at the IU as well in our report. So for instance, if you look at the accreditation and the SAP report, the reports of our evaluations on accreditation and the simplified approval process, SAP, which are coming out this summer, a lot of our findings and recommendations do take into account structures and incentives. So we are asking ourselves, what are the ways in which GCF, within its own family and within its own partnership, can create incentives for institutions to act in a certain way, which will yield results for the GCF. So we are taking those into account even at the level of our own evaluations, and we are confident that they will work.
Right. Thank you very much for that. So we're going to come back to the GCF context in a bit, but I want us to think about this one issue that I find very frustrating, okay? So I actually took a course in how to reduce carbon emissions in my daily life. It was with the UK, this not-for-profit organization, and so I learned about these very useful ways to reduce my own emission, right? However, when I think about my country, Korea, one of the big things that I see everywhere is that they don't even think about using plastic bags. They use it everywhere. Even these grandmothers having their own food stand or selling groceries, vegetables, or whatever. It's just, we don't even think about it. We keep using them. And I, trying to be a little more responsible in my daily practice, I tell them, no, that's okay. I brought my own eco bag. Therefore, you don't need to give me a plastic bag. But it just doesn't, it doesn't make sense to them because they've always done it and they will continue to do it. So there is that issue. How can we help those grandmothers, let's say merchants, change their behavior and make it really easy for them to do what's desirable from our perspective?
So one thing that Korea has already done that's helped me a lot personally reduce my plastic use is that now you have to pay for plastic bags. They ask you, do you want a plastic bag? And whereas in the past, I wouldn't have said no if they would have just given me a plastic bag. I wouldn't have been like, oh, no, thank you. Please put that plastic bag away, please. But now that they ask me, do you want to buy a plastic bag? I always say no. And something they've done in some countries with reusable plastic cups for your coffee, instead of giving you a discount for using a reusable cup, they ask you to pay for a plastic cup, which makes it very annoying to people that they have to shell out money, even though it's the same discount. People prefer to avoid a loss rather than realize a gain. Is that right, Cornelius?
Yes, it adds the loss on top of the regular price, so people feel the price of the cup more. But I want to caution that not every problem which is around human behavior should be solved by a nudge or a boost. If we take the example of plastic bags, some countries have outright banned the plastic bags, which was much more effective. And behavioral insights, behavioral interventions like nudges and boosts are very appealing because they don't tell you what to do. You still have the liberty to opt out of them. But on the level of society, we didn't tell people to opt out of slavery. We just outright banned it because it was bad for society. And this was done for pollutants. Now our freezer has to use materials which are less damaging for the atmosphere. So I think if we reach consensus, then we can ban certain elements. And that's much more effective. And there will still be plenty of decisions, plenty of space for behavioral insights to play its role.
Thank you for that, Cornelius. Yes, so I do hear you, Iben. You are right. In these bigger supermarkets, shops, they've instituted, such no plastic bag policy, or you have to pay for them. But I was more commenting on these grandmothers, old ladies that are selling their own produce at a very small scale shop. And for them, obviously, the plastic bags are the cheapest means. And so they just keep using them. And of course, I don't blame them. They have lived like that for ages. And so how can you institute a behavioral change? Or is there a way to actually educate them, although this would have to be really swift? So I think now that Cornelius has given his input that sometimes an outright ban might work better, I'm thinking maybe that's a policy that Korea could think about using. But at the same time, with the recent coronavirus pandemic, you've been to, the Korean public transportations, and then everywhere, everybody has been very good at wearing a mask. And so it's kind of given me hope that maybe it is still possible to educate these people, including senior citizens, to drive climate action. So I don't know. I think on the one hand, a ban on plastic bags whatsoever could be more effective and swifter. But on the other hand, I think maybe we could still have a chance, a more democratic and educational movement to drive out the plastic bags from our own lives.
Yeonji, you raise a very interesting point because we as a species are very adaptive, and the virus and the pandemic has taught us at least that one thing. Handshakes have I can't remember the last time I shook someone's hand when I met them. And it's just now second nature to all of us to not shake hands and stay far away, right? So we are a very adaptive civilization. But we also know from the literature that humans respond to three things: what we know, what we have, and what we feel. So if we could, if you want to, very superficially, if we wanted to reduce the use of plastic bags among small-scale shops, etc., we could potentially also look at those three factors of motivation: what they know about the usage of plastic bags, how they feel about it, and if they have other substitutes for the use of plastic bags.
Any other views on this issue of plastic bags?
Well, like Cornelius said, sometimes nudges and boosts are not enough. I mean, nudges and boosts are manipulating people's choices without actually manipulating their incentives at all. Sometimes you have to change incentives or propose an outright ban, as was suggested.
But even bans, I don't know if they work always unless you have a substitute, right? So there have been cases in the wildlife market, for instance, the sale of illegal wildlife products, where bans don't always work because there's the secondary market that starts, or the black market that starts. Probably won't work for plastic bags, but it might not always work unless there is a substitute. So again, coming back to, sorry to peddle it again, but what we know, what we have, and what we feel. So if we don't have a substitute and a second option, then an outright ban socially might not work.
All right, thank you for that. So let's bring this issue, this concept, into the GCF context a little more. So, I mean, Cornelius, so you looked at these 10 GCF projects in your best paper. Can you tell us one good example of where behavioral insights could be used more saliently in any of the projects?
So, projects, when we look at them, they are always about human behavior, because the project is only there for a certain time. But the key question when we look at behavioral insights is, what happens once the project ends? When all the consultants, all the trainers go away and people are left on their own. So that is how behavior change is crucial, because whatever infrastructure we put in there, it has to be operated and it has to be maintained in a good way. But with behavioral science, we face the problem that most of the literature, most of the empirical evidence that we have was conducted in Western countries. And we can't be sure that those results will hold in the developing countries where GCF is funding the project. So whenever we think of a concept that may work, we first have to go to the ground, have to talk about their worldviews, adapt our nudges to their culture, and then test them on a small scale. Otherwise, we can't reasonably know that our intervention will work.
Right. So in your paper, I'm looking at FP093, this specific project. You mentioned that it relies on investments by small businesses which require entrepreneurial mindsets. And so personal initiative trainings can strengthen these kinds of soft skills and have been found to be more effective than traditional business trainings. Can you elaborate more on this? What do you mean by personal initiative trainings?
This is a good example to actually explain what a boost is. Because the traditional business training focus on accounting skills, they focus on sales, on marketing, etc. So maybe people already know some of these skills, but they just don't apply it. Or otherwise, maybe they would learn it on their own if they were just trying hard enough. I know this is a bad assumption. But what those personal initiative trainings do is give those people ways to overcome small mind hurdles like, oh, how do I structure my day? How do I plan? How do I stay motivated when I face challenges? So it's not about how to do it, but how to keep going and how to push forward. So they teach them soft skills, which in the end improves the outcome for their businesses.
All right. So thank you for that. Can we talk about maybe one specific government policy or a development or climate project that has been successful because behavioral change considerations have been successfully integrated? Do you know of any one specific policy or program, even a GCF project?
I can come in. So the most powerful nudge is probably the default. So whatever option we set as the default, people will pick up the fastest. And even though this may not have been implemented in developing countries, but when we give people the option, the default option to enroll in renewable energies, they are most likely to purchase energy from renewable sources. So that way we can already reduce emissions by a certain amount.
Iben, do you have anything to add to that, this by default option?
The classic default is the organ donation, right? So in the European countries where you have to opt out of organ donation, but the default is that you're signed up for organ donation, have way higher rates of people who are signed up than the countries where you have to opt into organ donation, because people prefer to stick to the default. It's a very strong bias that we have.
Even though by default we say you have to get a training, people would actually opt for the training. That kind of puzzles me because people are very lazy. I mean, they can be lazy. They wouldn't necessarily invest their time and energy to get whatever training we put out there.
But I'm sure that the rates would be higher if you're automatically signed up for the training than if you have to sign yourself up. Technically, the choice is the same. You can opt out anytime, but if you're automatically opted in, fewer people will take the extra step to cancel.
And the same thing applies to things like gym memberships, which people want to cancel but don't cancel because the default is to stay signed on. But the literature on development is filled with instances of projects which have not worked because they didn't take into account the behaviors of people. You know, the multiple examples that come to mind from toilet usage in India, for instance, or supplying households with stoves in tropical deciduous climates where they preferred the smoke of the wood because it would dry up the house and preferred not to use stoves, for instance. In the context of the GCF, I think we are too early in the GCF disbursement cycles. We might not be able to identify behavioral interventions as the key, which made the difference between a successful and unsuccessful project. The other thing is too that we have to take into account that some of these projects have to adapt as they go along to take into account the local contexts. That uncertainty has also to be taken into account. But overall, it's just too soon for GCF projects to show results so far.
Mm-hmm. Right. So Cornelius, you talked about how institutions are beginning to take behavioral insights more seriously now. And so there is this Mind, Behavior, and Development Initiative. Can you briefly mention what this initiative is and perhaps introduce our own IEU initiative as well?
Yes, so this Mind, Behavior, and Development initiative was started by the World Bank in 2015 when their flagship report on development was all about behavioral insights and how they play a role for the projects that the World Bank was doing or the topics that they were dealing with. And since then, they have built up a unit which rolls out projects where they are applying behavioral insights. So since the end of last year, we have started the BaDLab, the Behavior and Design Lab within our own unit. And the idea is to analyze in our project, in every aspect of our work, what keeps actually people from taking up the project? What are the key barriers that people face and how can we facilitate a behavior change? But also in our evaluations, what is the behavioral component of that project or of that program? And we are at an early stage. We do not implement projects ourselves, but we want to make people think and raise awareness about that topic.
All right. So behavior and design lab. So you are trying to design human behavior. Is that it?
No, we don't design behaviors. You have quoted our paper, and there we were looking at a set of projects and see how behavioral insights, behavioral interventions could improve them. So we think about the concepts that others hopefully take into account into their project designs.
Mm-hmm. So just to our listeners, we will bring to you a full episode on the BaDLab, the IEU's Behavior and Design Lab. So you can look forward to that. So more to it later. All right. So wrapping up our conversation today, can we briefly talk about what is a common myth about behavioral insights and nudging? For instance, I mean, I'm now a huge fan of behavioral science, but of course, it shouldn't be a panacea of all kinds. It cannot be a solution to all types of problems that we have. So what is a common myth? And can you tell us, okay, that's a myth, and so what is the right answer? Archi?
Can I go first? So one of the myths would be that behavior science can provide us the answers. So for instance, you're talking about the problem of plastic, right, in Korea. Unless that problem is identified, behavior science can't actually help you deal with it. It can help you change behaviors in a certain way, but it can't tell you what the desired behavior itself is. I think a second myth would be that there's a lot of specificity in the literature on what should be done. I think a lot of literature still continues to deal with what is the best way to give out a message. In what way can, for instance, you convey to a household a message to reduce its electricity consumption. And there's a ton of research out there that identifies different kinds of patterns of that message and which one works best in what context. So that specificity, the literature is still developing. It's still developing that kind of insights. And I think another key myth would be that it does not apply to us. We tend to forget sometimes as professionals that we are as subject to behavioral insights as anybody else, that we are as irrational as any of the communities we work with. And a lot of our own behaviors are so predictable that we can apply behavior science to our own ways in which we operate in our daily lives, whether it be intra-office communications, inter-office discussions, and inter-organizational behaviors. So a lot of that literature can apply to our own levels as well.
Thank you very much for that, Archie. I was just reminded how I struggle to wake up early myself and start my day early, right? So I do need to apply these behavioral insight lessons as well to my own daily life. Okay, Iben, go ahead.
One of the myths that I've noticed is that people tend to misunderstand behavioral insights as something that takes choices away from people. Nudges and boosts are not about actively taking choices away from people. It's about altering people's choice architecture or giving them more information.
Thank you for that, Cornelius.
I just want to add on that nowadays a lot of things are called a nudge, referring to the nudge intervention, even though they are not so like pressuring people socially or paying them money to do so. So the nudge itself is just about altering the choice architecture, but not about changing the choice set itself. If I'm using social pressure, that is certainly not a nudge, and that's not what we're talking about as a behavioral intervention.
Summing up, behavioral science operates on the premise that humans are irrational and often make poor choices, despite the existence of strong evidence against them. And through the right nudges and boosts and a careful altering of the choice architecture, we can make it easier for people to choose options that are more climate-friendly and sustainable at homes, shops, schools, and workplaces. Behavioral science, of course, cannot be a panacea for everything, but it can certainly enhance the effectiveness and impact of climate projects. Well, is that a fair summary of our discussion today?
Thank you so much, Yeonji.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cornelius, Iben, and Archie, for joining me today. We hope you enjoyed this episode of The Evaluator by the Independent Evaluation Unit of the Green Climate Fund. This episode was hosted by Yeonji Kim, produced by Yeonji Kim together with Ms. Iben Hjorth, and edited by Ms. Iben Hjorth. We'll be back with more insightful and interesting dialogues that matter for the evaluation and climate action communities. So, stay tuned and thank you for listening. Remember to tweet your thoughts about the show at GCF_eval with the hashtag #TheEvaluator. That's all for now. Signing off from the IEU headquarters in Songdo, Korea. Thank you very much. 고맙습니다.